Hey everybody, what's up? Thank you so much for joining me today. If you are new here, my name is Katie and this is my YouTube channel, Rouse Rising.
Smoke.
Like to talk to you about Hagen's birth story. Hagen is my second child, and when I was 8 months postpartum from having my first child, Riker, we found out that I was pregnant again. It was quite a surprise, but we were very excited about it. The beginning of my pregnancy was a little bit rough. I definitely experienced nausea until about week 14. I had daily, all day long, all night long nausea for the first trimester. As things went along, I started to feel better and I started to have more energy, and I was able to resume chasing around my toddler and doing normal everyday activities. I was ready to eat more nutritious foods and that kind of thing around the 15-16 week mark. Around 20 weeks, we went and had our anatomy scan where they checked everything over to make sure that she was healthy and growing well. And at that 20-week scan, they discovered that I had a low-lying posterior placenta. My placenta at that time was about 1.7 centimeters from the OS. The OS is the cervical opening where the womb comes down, and then there's the cervix opening where the baby comes out. And my placenta was very close to the rim of that opening. So my pregnancy at that point became high risk. And that for me was incredibly heartbreaking. I learned that I would not be able to have a second home birth with Hagen. I wasn't going to be allowed. Our first child was born at home, and one of these days, probably closer to his birthday, I will go over his birth story and give you guys all those details. So coming off of having our first baby at home and then learning that we would have to birth our second baby in the hospital and potentially have a cesarean birth, I was faced with the fact that the hospital and my OBs were encouraging me to have a cesarean. That was very scary and difficult for me to take. And I remember feeling incredibly overwhelmed and incredibly just sad. I remember feeling very terrified that I was going to die. I had all these beliefs surrounding cesarean birth that and surrounding Marginal Previa, which was the condition that we were labeled with at that time. So moving forward, the OBs at the hospital we were at, and at this time we were living in England. We had a military base where we were living, and I was being seen by OBs at that time. I was also seeing a midwife, and up until 20 weeks, my plan was to birth with the same midwife that had attended our first child's birth. And at 20 weeks, when we realized that that wasn't a possibility any longer, we decided to hire our midwife on to consult us throughout the rest of my pregnancy and also to possibly be my doula in the hospital. So at the 20-week mark, they were recommending that every 4 weeks I get an ultrasound to check the position of my placenta. And I was not okay with that. I just didn't want to have that many ultrasounds every few weeks. I didn't want to go in and have ultrasounds. I just didn't want that kind of disturbance to the baby. And so we chose to wait until farther along in the 3rd trimester before we had another ultrasound to check the position of the placenta. So at that time, at 20 weeks, my placenta was measuring 1.7 centimeters from the OS. And my midwife was requiring that my placenta be 2 centimeters or greater distance from my OS before she would consider attending a home birth. So at this point, home birth was just out of the question, but I was really hoping, because there is a chance that your placenta can move, I was really hoping that further along in pregnancy, they would do an ultrasound and find that miraculously my placenta moved. At about 36 weeks, I consented to have another ultrasound to check the position of my placenta, and my placenta had actually gotten closer to the OS. It was now 1.5 centimeters from the OS. That was devastating for me, because at that point my OBs were strongly encouraging me to have a cesarean section. And that was something that I just was not okay with, but it was something that I was trying to be okay with. And I remember discussing this possibility with my midwife, and she had some reassuring things to say to me. Because I was a doula at that time and just very into birth and everything surrounding birth, ultimately at that time I had wanted to be a midwife, and I wanted to work with families, birthing families in any capacity that I could. So my midwife's words to me that gave me reassurance and made me feel a lot better were, she said, "Katie, think of it this way. If you go into hospital and you have a cesarean birth, that is going to provide you with more insight into the birth world and more insight and compassion for families that are faced with cesarean births. That's going to give you more tools, more information, more understanding of that type of birth, and you will be able to better support families." And I appreciated that very much. She also told me at that time that she kind of went over with me my options and things that my OBs were not telling me. My OBs just went straight to, "We're going to schedule you for a cesarean, and that's it. You're just going to have a cesarean." And I said, "I'm not prepared to schedule for a cesarean at this time. I'm not going to schedule it." And my midwife gave me lots of information and statistics surrounding Marginal Previa, and she told me the percentages and the risks so that I could make an educated decision. Now, she worked for the NHS, and she was also an independent midwife. She was an independent midwife, and she served the NHS in England, and she was a breech birth specialist as well. She delivered many breech babies vaginally, and she had a lot more information at her fingertips than I had. So she provided me with information that allowed me to make an informed and educated decision about having a cesarean. I did not schedule a cesarean. What I chose was a trial of labor. And my OBs agreed to that, and they said, "If at any point in your pregnancy you start bleeding, you come into the hospital immediately." And I agreed that I would do that. At about 38 weeks, my baby was still breech, and my babies they have all tended to be breech or flip-flopping back and forth until about a week or two before I actually go into natural labor. At 38 weeks, up until about 40 weeks, I believe, we checked again at 40 weeks. At 38 weeks, she was breech, and at 40 weeks, she had flipped head down. And at that time, I was already due for my cesarean, and they were really encouraging me to induce at 40 weeks because they were aware that I was not going to have a cesarean at that time. I wanted a trial of labor. And so at 40 weeks, they began encouraging me to induce. And I armed myself with information, and I chose that I would not induce, that I would in fact continue to wait for that trial of labor that I so desperately wanted. So at 40 weeks, she was head down, she was vertex, and I was prepared to go into labor at any time. And I was not surprised that I did not go into labor when I anticipated that I might possibly, but my previous and first birth, I went to 42 weeks. So I was prepared that I would also go to 42 weeks with this baby, or longer, but I really hoped that I wouldn't go longer than 42 weeks because this hospital on base would not take me if I went into labor after 42 weeks. They said induction at 42 weeks or we will not take you. So I agreed to NSTs, which are non-stress tests of mother and baby every few days for the last 2 weeks of my pregnancy. And it might have even started at 38 weeks. I'm not exactly clear when the NST started, but I'm positive that by 40 weeks I was having 2 NSTs a week. And that was just where I went into the hospital. They hooked me up to monitoring. And once they hooked me up to monitoring, they would just monitor me for about an hour or two. I would just lay in the bed and be monitored that the baby's heart rate was right, that she was having the proper decels and accelerations of her heartbeat with movement, and that my placenta was still operating and functioning correctly, and that there weren't any concerns. So as long as I was willing to do the NSTs, they were willing to wait and still have me as a patient until I went into natural labor. So I was about 41 weeks and 6 days, I believe. It was a Sunday morning. I remember very vividly. I woke up, and it's gonna make me tear up. I remember thinking, I was like, gosh, I'm never gonna go into labor, and I'm gonna have to consent to this induction that I don't want. And my induction was actually scheduled for that Tuesday. So, it was awful. So I woke up that morning and I cried to my husband. And I was like, we just need to go do something. We need to go do something in town just to take my mind off of the fact that I'm still pregnant. So we went into the town of Bury St. Edmunds and we did some window shopping. And after a few hours of window shopping, we went to eat at this restaurant called Nando's. And there I had a spicy chicken salad. And that's a funny point, and I'll tell you why. Because a few weeks later, I had a friend who also went to Nando's and had a spicy chicken salad and went into labor. Well, while I'm eating the salad, I was having just a little bit of cramping and some uncomfortableness, but nothing that I would check mark as, oh, this is labor. It was just normal Braxton Hicks. I have Braxton Hicks basically from about 8 weeks onward. As soon as I can feel my uterus above my pubic bone, it's just a little hump right above my pubic bone, I can basically feel my Braxton Hicks. My whole pregnancy, my uterus gets rock hard, and I can feel the lump there in my belly. So I was having Braxton Hicks my whole pregnancy, and it was nothing unusual for me to be having tightening and a little bit of cramping. So I didn't think much of it, but as we drove home, it was about a 40-minute drive back to our home to Westrow. I was having, some mild surges. So when we got home, I promptly started nesting. I started getting my cloth diapers ready. I started sitting on the toilet, seeing if I could get my bottom to loosen up and see if I could get more contractions going. And after about 4 hours at home, I was definitely having timeable contractions. The hospital had told me, and my OBs had told me, the moment that labor starts, you need to come straight to the hospital, because once your labor starts, you are at an increased risk for hemorrhaging. And as your cervix opens, you could hemorrhage. Your placenta could separate from the wall and you could start bleeding really badly. So the moment that you know that you're in labor, you come straight into the hospital. Well, at this point, I was in denial that I was in labor. So about 3 hours into having surges, I was still in denial that I was in labor. So I went into the bathroom by myself and shut the door and sat on the toilet, and I had probably 3 massive contractions. Ones that I was vocalizing through, and my husband and my son heard me, and I could hear my son out in the living room going, moo. He was mooing just as I had been doing in the bathroom. And when I came out, I was still vocalizing through these contractions and mooing. And that's kind of how I cope with surges and labor. I make a lot of noise, and you guys can watch my other birth videos. I have recorded my last 2 births. And yes, I am a noisemaker in labor. It's just one thing that I do. It's the tone and the voice and the relaxing of my mouth and jaw and throat that helps me to open up. It allows me to relax my bottom and open up, and it allows for my labor to progress a lot quicker for me to vocalize that way. And in subsequent labors, I have perfected it basically because my labors were very fast. So at about the 4-hour mark of having regular contractions at home, we called our friends who were going to be watching our son. And at this point, he was about 17 months old. And our wonderful friends, it was, gosh, what time was it? It was like 10 o'clock at night, I think. We drove over to their house, and they were very close to the hospital. They lived on base, and the hospital was on base. So we drove to their house, and I tearfully dropped my son off. Oh, and one other point I need to make. I was so afraid that I was going to die in the hospital giving birth to my second child that I had quite a few friends who were either due to give birth or had given birth around the same time that I was due with my second baby. And we were all very open, very close-knit community. And I had asked them, and they had asked me the same thing. If I die in birth, will you donate milk to my baby? Will you make sure that my husband has what he needs to feed the baby? So in our little community, all of my friends, we all kind of had this pact and this agreement that if we died giving birth, and all of us were having our second babies, that we would provide breast milk to the new baby and be sure that the baby had breast milk. I mean, crazy that we even thought of that stuff, but those were things that were going through my mind, being a high-risk pregnancy, and those were things that were going through my friends' minds as well, that they already had a child at home, and then they were having their second baby, and for whatever reason, we all just, I think it was being a mother already, we wanted to be prepared for that. You know, when you have your first child, you're just kind of naive about motherhood in general. But when you're having your second child, you have all these fears, you have all of these things that you're faced with, and just knowing intuition of the mother, and you know, you plan for everything, and you plan for the unexpected. You just plan out every single detail. So I had some really great friends, and Riker, my oldest, I was still breastfeeding him at this time. So it was really great that he was going to stay with some friends of ours that were going to be able to look after him and care for him while my husband and I were in the hospital delivering our second baby. So, sorry, my 4th child is out there crying. I'm wondering if she's hurt, but Daddy's out there with her. I might have to bring her in here with me. So we were very fortunate to have some trustworthy friends that we could feel really good about leaving our son with. So at about 10 or 10:30, we dropped him with our friends, and I have to tell you about the drive to the hospital. So English roads are really brutal, and especially where we were, they're just very wavy, like crazy roads. And at this point, my son was still awake when we packed up the car to head to the hospital. And on the way to the hospital, there is one dip in the road that is really intense. So my husband is going a little bit fast to the hospital, and he's driving down this road, and I feel a surge coming on, and I know this dip is coming in the road, and I'm like, slow down, and I'm going into a surge. He hits that dip full speed, and I'm just holding on for dear life because I just know the baby's gonna fly out of me. And so as he's hitting the dip, he slows down because he's like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And I was like, it's okay. It's okay. I was having a contraction, and right when you were hitting that dip, I was like, just slow down. The baby's not coming right this second. Just get us to the hospital without causing me any more discomfort like that, was kind of the point that I was trying to get across to him. So we get to my friend's house. I'm kind of weepy. I'm crying. I hand my son over. Our son had actually fallen asleep in the car on our way there. So we hand him over, and I'm pretty sure that they had an easy time getting him back to sleep or whatever, I hope. And we go to the hospital and we get admitted, and they see in the notes that I need to have continuous monitoring. And when you have continuous monitoring, you cannot use a labor pool. So I was pretty adamant that I wanted intermittent monitoring, and they honored that because I was not going to do continuous monitoring. I was like, hey, if I start bleeding, you guys can take me to emergency cesarean, you can take me to surgery, like whatever. But as long as I'm not showing any signs of distress, the baby's okay, everything's fine, I want to be allowed to do these things. And the hospital was very accommodating. They agreed, and I had the most amazing labor nurse. It turned out that her husband was into downhill mountain biking, and I come from an extreme sports background, motocross, mountain biking, snowboarding, all that. And so it really helped me and took my mind off of labor between contractions to be able to talk with that nurse. So we had a really good time for a few hours just talking about things between contractions, because I'm a talker, and unless I'm in transition, I am talking between contractions and joking around and carrying on. I was obviously in active labor. Let me backtrack just a little bit. So as we're walking into the hospital, I took some rescue remedy to calm my nerves, because my husband and I were walking into the hospital and I just lost it. Like, I was a nervous wreck. This was terrifying for me to go into hospital and have a baby, because I just knew of all the interventions that they would try to implement, and I was just terrified of having to fight for the birth that I wanted. So the rescue remedy really helped. It was something that my midwife had recommended to me. She's like, hey, take this if you're feeling stressed. It's just a natural flower remedy that you can take. It's safe for pregnancy. So anyways, so we get into the hospital. They hook me up to intermittent monitoring. They get the labor pool in there. They had some issues and some trouble trying to find everything they needed to fill the pool up, because this was all still kind of new back then, and it was definitely new in this hospital to have a labor pool there for patients to use, for mothers to use. So they were getting everything together and filling up the pool and doing that kind of stuff. And in the meantime, the baby was being monitored and I was being monitored. And at that stage, everything was fine. So I was allowed to get into the labor pool. And I think every half hour or every 15 minutes or so, they would come in and they would check baby's heart rate. I would have to either get out of the pool or they would Doppler the baby's heart rate. And then I think that they would monitor for like 10, 15 minutes. I'm not really clear on the details of that, but I did have intermittent monitoring just to make sure that everything was okay, to be sure that there wasn't any bleeding, because one of the first signs of hemorrhage is baby's heart rate. And so they were able to determine that she was fine and everything was fine, and we could keep going forward with my natural birth plan. So I'd say about 2.5 hours after being in the hospital, I started to get real pushy in the tub. We did not tell anybody that I was feeling pushy, and we didn't tell anybody that I was getting pushy. They heard me. And so, oh, bless you. So all the nurses came rushing in. They heard me bearing down, and they came rushing in. They called the doctor. They tried to convince me to get out of the labor pool. I was very hesitant to do so. I was very hesitant to get out of the labor pool, but I did. And they wanted me to get into the bed. They wanted me to get into the bed and on my back and push this baby out. Nope, not happening. I refuse. I absolutely refuse. I was like, you are not putting me in that bed on my back. I'm not going to do it. You can't make me. So I was leaning over the pool at that time, and I wanted to get down on the floor on all fours. So one of the nurses brought me a yoga mat, And I got down on the floor, and my husband sat on one of those large exercise balls. He sat on the exercise ball, and I was on my knees in front of him, and I was holding on to his belt loops. And he was my anchor. So I had my head kind of like on one of his thighs, like into his stomach, and I was just getting through my contractions that way, vocalizing, that kind of thing. Next thing you know, the doctor swoops into the room, the nurses hold up his jacket, and I just remember like looking back at him and the nurses, because I heard the nurses saying like, she won't get into the bed. And he was like, no big deal, I'll attend her on the floor. And so, great doctor, Dr. Metz, amazing doctor. I had actually never even met him in my pregnancy. Never once had I had him as my OB in any of my prenatal appointments. Yeah. So Dr. Metz just swooped in, put on his doctor gear, knelt down on the floor, caught my baby as I pushed her out, passed her through my legs. I held my baby right there, and I stood up and walked over and got into the bed. At this point, typically what they like to do in hospitals is they like to administer Pitocin, and I wasn't going to let them take my baby from me, and I wasn't going to let them cut the cord until after the placenta was delivered. So I had my baby on me, cord still attached, doctor between my legs, tugging on the cord. He would just kind of tug it every once in a while. He's like, do you feel like you need to push yet? And I'm like, no, I don't feel anything. So the whole time, the nurse came over, one of the nurses would come over and try to put something in my IV line, because I did have I did consent to have a port, an IV, not an IV, an IV wasn't ever attached, but I had the thing in my wrist, which was really uncomfortable the whole labor. I did have that, and one of the nurses did keep trying to give me Pitocin, and she was really worried, and the whole time the doctor was just like, no, she's fine, everything's fine. He just reassured her that a physiological third stage sometimes takes time. And I explained to them, with my first baby, my placenta took 45 minutes to come out. And I don't know if that was just me being terrified to push it out or whatever, but it took 45 minutes. I had a great midwife. She had me in different positions trying to get the placenta out, but it just took 45 minutes. And what would you know? This placenta of my second baby was taking 45 minutes to come out. The whole time the doctor was monitoring my bleeding, they were monitoring my blood pressure, they were monitoring baby as she laid on my chest, skin to skin, and everything was fine. And the nurse was just really nervous. She really wanted to give me that Pitocin to make the placenta to come out, to make me, to decrease my chance of hemorrhaging. But it was not necessary. I never got that shot of Pitocin, much to her dismay. And the doctor ultimately helped me get my placenta out, and there was no issues. We had a very high risk natural birth in hospital after refusing a cesarean, after refusing an induction, after refusing constant monitoring. So these were all decisions that I made. These are all decisions that I made with all the information that I had. So I wasn't making uninformed choices. I was making informed choices with all the information that was available to me, with all of the different, with what was happening with my body and my baby. We took that information with the monitoring and everything else to continue to make informed decisions. And so for me, it really worked out that I declined that recommended cesarean because it wasn't necessary. Now, many OBs, if you have marginal previa, they prefer for you to be 2 centimeters or greater before they will allow you to have a vaginal birth. I was at 1.5 centimeters, and I mean, they didn't really have a choice. I just didn't consent to a cesarean unless there was an emergent need. And thankfully, there was no emergent need at any point to have a cesarean, so I was able to have my second baby naturally without intervention in the hospital. And I just want to encourage any woman that is facing marginal previa. Now, there are different types of previa, and marginal previa is one of the less severe. It is the less severe of the different types of previa that there is. But I just want to encourage any mother that is facing that to do your due diligence and research everything that you can. If you are high risk, make sure that you research everything you can. If you're going to give birth in the hospital, make sure you research everything that you can, given every scenario that you might be faced with. Please research every single intervention, and just know that you have choices and that you have options. And that just because a doctor recommends something doesn't mean that you have to go along with it. If the information and the statistics and the percentages say otherwise, if your risk is low, then you don't have to consent to certain recommended interventions. Now, that's not to say to put your life in danger or that you're putting your baby's life in danger. It just means that you're making informed decisions given the information that you have. And for me, a cesarean in my situation would have been way more risky with way more potential complications than having a trial of labor. So Hagen was born and she was absolutely beautiful and perfect. She weighed 7 pounds, 14 ounces, just 1 ounce bigger than our first baby, who was 7 pounds, 13 ounces. And I think I stayed that night in the hospital, and then I stayed one more night in the hospital, simply because they wouldn't discharge the baby, and they threatened that if I discharged the baby, that insurance would not cover my birth. And so we stayed in the hospital an extra night. Our friends watched our son the first night we were there. The second night, my husband went home and he stayed with our son at home the second night. And then the second day, because we had gotten there pretty late at night, so I stayed one night, a whole day, another night, and then the next day, baby was discharged and we were able to go home. I was actually discharged the very next day. I was allowed to stay in the hospital. They fed me, and I was able to stay there with the baby. She never left my sight. I kept her in the room with me the whole time. I did not allow them to bathe her. We didn't bathe her until we got home a few days later. And yeah, you don't have to let them take your baby out of the room. You don't have to consent to any interventions with the baby in the postpartum. You don't have to consent to that first bath in the hospital. There are many things that you have choices about, and I just encourage everybody to research your options and to make informed choices. I really just want to say thank you guys so much for listening to this birth story. It is Hagen's birthday month, and I wanted to share her birth story with you all and hopefully give those of you who are experiencing a high-risk pregnancy a little bit of hope and some empowerment that you can research and make informed choices for yourself and for your baby. Thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, click subscribe so you can stay up to date with our family and all of our most recent vlogs. Thanks for watching. Bye.